So today we are going to a site so evocative of a deeply ancient past, so shrouded in mystery that we don't even know how to pronounce its name. Is that Knossos, like as in knowledge, or no? It's actually Knossos, as in knish. And if you don't know what a knish is and all its potatoy goodness, head over to your nearest kosher deli. And if you don't live near a kosher deli, check out the links below where I have a pretty good video showing you how you could make it for yourself. All right, so Knossos. Now that we've gotten that important business out of the way, the good news is we can largely skip the history lesson for today because I already gave you the ancient stuff in the last Signet Rings archaeology porn segment. So today we're purely going to focus on the 19th and 20th century excavations and the present day visit. So Knossos seems to have been the palace that was at the center of Minoan civilization. But unfortunately, if you remember, we don't have anything written at the time of its golden age because that all would have been in Linear A, which until today we still can't decipher. So the only written records is all that boring accounting stuff in Linear B, which anyway was after Crete came to be dominated by the Mycenaeans from the mainland of Greece. However, it's by far the most complex and largest palatial center from this era. So it's definitely something you'll want to see. And incidentally, it is the second most visited archaeological site in all of Greece. And that's also certainly helped by its accessibility. It's just about, I think, 3.5 miles or 5.5 kilometers outside of Heraklion, which is a pretty big city, and it's easily accessible on public transport or by car. So when you go there, you'll certainly see why it's so visited. However, my first recommendation is not to go there, at least right away. First, you want to head over to the Heraklion Archaeological Museum right in the center of town. Why? Well, first, even if you're an assiduous viewer and listener of this channel, realistically, by the time you go there, you'll probably have forgotten everything I'm going to tell you. So that is the place to brush up on your history of the site and the importance of the civilization, etc. Second, it's probably the best place to see the largest portion of the treasures from Knossos and Minoan civilization in general. Also, there's a fair bit at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, and the rest is spread around the world. A lot just about 2 blocks from here in the British Museum, and some, of course, at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, which we'll be talking about later. Our tale begins in 1877 when the first excavations of Knossos began. And just like the ancient history, the modern history of this site is also shrouded in mystery. Now, why is that? Well, this was a very tumultuous time in the history of Crete. It was governed by the Ottoman Empire, which was in a state of rapid decline, thanks in large part to nationalistic movements all over it, especially in the Balkans. And this was no exception in Crete. And this earned the empire the moniker the sick man of Europe. So Crete had its own regional parliament at this point, and that was the concession that the Ottoman Empire and also the Austro-Hungarian Empire had to give to a lot of places to keep the locals happy. So Crete was one of them. And you may not realize this, but archaeology as a discipline rose around this time because of nationalism. You see, it provided sort of a scientific justification for that nationalism. In other words, we the people have always belonged here, we belong here, and this stuff that we're pulling out of the ground that belongs to our culture shows that we've always belonged here. So not surprisingly, it began to be used as a symbolism in all kinds of national symbols and emblems. For example, even Napoleon, some decades earlier, Napoleon Bonaparte, on his coronation regalia, he included in multiple ways this sort of bee that was actually a locust that had been found in France in the tomb of a early Frankish kingdom, very early medieval times. and he adopted that as a symbol of France. But anyway, that's another story. So nationalist forces pushed for archaeological excavations all over the empire, which the local Ottoman officials were reluctant to grant for obvious reasons. And in fact, it was through a liberal reading of his firman and a few bribes here and there that Lord Elgin was able to cart off the Parthenon marbles off to London, because when he did that in the early 19th century, Athens was part of the Ottoman Empire. Anyway, that's another story. So in 1877, the initial excavations took place at what was then known as Kefala Hill. And these were led by Minos Karakaranos. He was a local businessman and antiquarian, which is basically the pre-20th century, pre-professional version of an archaeologist, basically an intense hobbyist. Now, those 1877 digs were very limited, and the real full-scale thing happened in 1878. Now, the details are hazy, but Kallikerino seems to have gotten a firman and acquired the land, because you had to do that at that day and age. So he acquired a little bit of land on site. And it seems like he dug about 12 trenches, but he was able to bust into the cellars of Knossos, although he didn't know it was Knossos quite at the time, and found a bunch of stuff, including some pithoi that amazingly still had foodstuffs in it. I'm guessing preserved olive oil. So it was off to a good start, but not so fast. You see, the Ottomans had a habit of taking local archaeological finds and carting them off to the capital at Constantinople, now Istanbul, where many of them still reside even to this day. This was a way they could appropriate these archaeological treasures as part of a vast cosmopolitan empire, not the heritage of some troublesome nationalist tradition that was, stirring the pot. It was also just another good way that the Sultan could get his hands on some goodies.
It's good to be the king.
So fearing this, the Parliament of Crete actually stepped in to stop the excavations after a few weeks in 1878. Or, in other tellings, it was actually the local Ottoman authorities that put the kibosh on everything. Well, we don't know for sure, but the fact is the site was closed for the time being. However, Kallikernos had found enough, including part of what is interpreted today as the throne room, to feel confident in declaring this to be the Knossos, the center of Minoan civilization. So everybody's appetite was whetted for more excavations, but the political situation was getting very hot, and the Ottomans were not in the mood to grant any more firmans. Certainly, lots of foreign archaeologists had applied for them, but the Ottomans suspected, rightfully so, that most of them were sympathetic to the Cretans, and they were. The situation totally changed in 1898 when there was a wide-scale uprising on the island of Crete. And unlike the previous ones in the 1860s, 1870, which ended in massacres of tens of thousands of civilians, this one actually succeeded. But in addition to the other destruction and death that was wrought, unfortunately, the artifacts and the reports from that initial series of digs were destroyed. And this happened along with the death of Kallikernos' brother at the hands of the Ottoman population. Now, what this did result in, though, was the Ottomans abandoning the island, and in fact, an independent country of Crete was founded under nominally the Ottoman Empire, but it was basically independent. And this situation lasted until 1908, when it merged with the independent Kingdom of Greece. Well, almost immediately, the archaeologists went buck wild. And now enter Arthur Evans. He was the director, then called keeper, of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, which I mentioned before. And he had been tooling around in Greece and the Balkans for some time, acquiring stuff for the museum, which in those days at best basically entailed buying it off unprovenanced of anyone who would sell it and cart it back off to London, which is a big no-no today, of course.
Belongs in a museum. So do you.
Well, he had been acquiring some of the seal stones and signet rings and other bits and bobs, which we talked about in the archaeology porn segment. And he had become enthralled with the script he found on them, which would later come to be known as Linear A and Linear B, which we've already talked about. During his travels, Evans met Heinrich Schliemann, who at that point was one of the most famous men in the world for having located and excavated ancient Troy and ancient Mycenae. And there he found loads of treasure, which he named Priam's treasure and Agamemnon's treasure after the two dueling kings in the Trojan War, as told by Homer's Iliad. And by the way, the treasure of Mycenae, that's in Athens, not Mycenae, in the National Archaeological Museum. And Priam's treasure, that's in somewhere in Russia. Well, the thing is, that treasure Schliemann carted off back with him to Berlin, where he was from, and there it stayed. But when the Nazi regime collapsed at the end of World War II, the Russians came in and took all of the gold and brought it back with them to the Soviet Union. And they only confirmed somewhat recently, I think in the 1990s, that they had it, but it was not seen ever since in public, I think, and they're not going to part with it. So, with all his enthusiasm for Eastern Mediterranean prehistory, Evans was off to the races. As soon as Crete gained independence, and perhaps even before, he acquired land at Knossos, remember, which is what you had to do, right around Kallikranos' land, and he was in line ahead of all the other archaeologists that wanted to dig. Now, what can we say about these excavations that lasted 6 years from 1900 to 1905? First of all, they were hugely successful, finding all of those pithoi, frescoes, pottery, tablets, and other artifacts that we can still see today. However, they were more than excavations. They were restorations and reconstructions, which is a big no-no today, and even back then was highly controversial. You see, obviously the palace was not in great shape, and unfortunately, after the first season of excavations, little was done to protect it. And so after a particularly bad winter, a lot of it got really badly weathered and quite frankly washed away. So in the second season, a decision was made not just to do your archaeology, but to reconstitute and restore as stuff was being uncovered. So all those frescoes you see, they were in fragmentary and sort of flaky condition. So as they were uncovered, they were being repainted and put together. And that's really important to understand. What you see today is a pretty educated guess as to what it may have looked like with the evidence on site. But it is not what it looked like when it was found, and it certainly was not what it looked like when it was in its heyday. This is archaeologically sacrilegious, especially because the technology and practices in those days were so rudimentary compared with today. So there was so much information that was lost as a result. And it's not like archaeologists today would reconstruct the site, but even if they chose to do that, their version would definitely be more accurate than what was produced 100 or 121 years ago. However, on the other hand, Arthur's right-hand man, Duncan Mackenzie, was the one who actually led the day-to-day operations. And he was an experienced archaeologist that did a very capable job. So he was able to identify the major layers of stratigraphy and phasing of the site, that a lot of which, stood up to the test of time. So it was a good, thorough excavation from which we learned quite a bit. And what they were able to find, of course, that in its hundreds of years in existence, Knossos was, of course, destroyed a couple times and rebuilt and expanded a lot over the course of its life. So despite the limitations, the excavations actually did produce a ton of information about Knossos and the basic story of what happened there. And, even though the lack of reliable dating methods created a lot of controversy about the temporal relationship between Mycenae and Knossos, that has since been clarified. So we have a much better understanding today. However, at the same time, Evans wove in with all these facts a very elaborate mythology that he sort of came up with in his interpretation of the site and its history. And, a lot of that held up, but a lot of it also proved to be very wrong. So some of it is still with us today, and some of it has been discarded. For example, Evans was convinced that the Mycenaean polities were merely colonies of the Minoan civilization populated with Minoan people. And this was later disproved by American archaeologist Carl Blegan. Now, he would go on to excavate Pylos, which was where our Griffin warrior and all his rings were found just a couple of years ago. And Blegan would also go on to do a second round at Troy. And he successfully refuted Evans' characterizations of the history. A great example of Evans' surviving legacy is the name Minoan itself. Now, this is tied up with the Greek myth of the Minotaur and King Minos, which I'm not going to recount in full here. First of all, it's just a little bit too much of a digression. Second of all, like other Greek mythology, it's batshit crazy. Remember, this is a mythology which had Athena sprouting fully grown from Zeus's forehead, people sleeping with their mothers, and all kinds of sordid stuff. But the very short version essentially is King Minos, who was the king of Crete, had a son, or actually it wasn't his son, it was his wife's son with a bull that turned out to be half man, half bull. That was the Minotaur. But yeah, we don't do bestiality on this channel, so I'm just going to leave it at that. Anyway, the Minotaur liked to eat people, so King Minos had a big maze built for him and put him in there so he wouldn't harm anyone. So when Evans uncovered Knossos, he saw a giant maze, a labyrinth of all those what would turn out to be storage rooms. He saw bull's horns and bull imagery everywhere. And he saw all those carvings of that double axe. So putting it all together, the bull imagery, the labyrinth, King Minos of Crete, and Evans dubbed this Minoan society, which we still call it today. And then he did something even more speculative. You see, the word labrys means double axe in Lydian, which is an ancient extinct language from Anatolia, which existed at the same time as ancient Greece. And what Evans therefore interpreted was looking at all those double axes, which again in Lydian is labrys. He said this must be the labyrinth, which means or could mean the house of the double axe.
You have 13 hours in which to solve the labyrinth before your baby brother becomes one of us forever.
And though his hypothesis is still tenuous, Evans' case may have been bolstered by a bit of Linear B tablet, which was, of course, translated after his death, unfortunately. He died in 1941. Ventris cracked the code of Linear B in 1952. So Arthur would never come to hear that actually a lot of his hypotheses were false. But anyway, this tablet discussed a jar of honey that was to be distributed to the mistress of the labyrinth. Now, Knossos certainly seems like a labyrinth. And even though we don't know about the power structure or social organization there, based on all the imagery, it's difficult to imagine that there weren't priestesses based at Knossos. And moreover, even if he was wrong about the name Labyrinth, Evans may very well have been onto something. You see, when the ancient Greeks came across Knossos, because remember, it's 800 years or so older than what we know as Greek antiquity, they may have developed the myth of the Minotaur to explain what they found. And let me explain. Remember, in that long, like 700-800 year gap between the final destruction of Knossos and really the rise of Greek antiquity, There were the Dark Ages, which were called that because a lot of the written history was lost. So imagine the ancient Greeks or Lydians, perhaps, who were, of course, in the larger East Mediterranean community and later would become Hellenized. Well, they found this place with its maze and its bull imagery everywhere. And of course, it would have been in better shape than when Evans found it. So they found this, somewhat intact labyrinth place, and they didn't know how to explain it. So maybe this is when they came up with the myth of the Minotaur to sort of put the pieces together. And furthermore, it could even be guessed that this may have been their way of explaining all the seismic activity in the region. This mighty monster frustrated and raring to escape his subterranean prison. And they, of course, saw the double axes everywhere. Now, it's true that there are double axes on lots of other structures in the Minoan and Mycenaean world, so maybe those are the labyrinth. But anyway, it's totally plausible that this is how the myth came down to us today. So all of this, as well as his controversial reconstruction, left an indelible mark on how we think of Knossos today. And even calling it a palace, which Evans certainly did, is a little sus. Because, when you say palace, we understand that to mean the residential quarters and seat of a reigning king or queen. Now, Knossos may have been that, although there's not really much direct evidence for that. But it was certainly a lot of other things that we don't necessarily, associate with palaces. It was a site for the collection of taxation in the form of largely wool and other things. It was a place where a class of women spun that wool into fabric. And it was certainly the seat of the priestly class. Now, even that throne, who says that that throne belonged to a king or queen? Why not the high priestess or high priest? And of course, in this day and age, way back when, a lot of the governments seemed to be theocracies. The religion and the political power were merged. So there's no reason to believe necessarily that Knossos and Minoan society was any different. So maybe it was the seat of kind of like the Pope or Popess of that day. Anyway, who knows? But whatever you think of Evans, you can't fault him for being such a passionate and even obsessive sort of godfather figure for Knossos and the Minoan civilization. In fact, he was so enthusiastic that he himself not only acquired the land, but he funded all of the excavations for those 6 years. So even though he was a rich man, he basically went broke. And it wasn't helped by the fact that in 1907, Kallikranos, that original excavator, well, he actually sued Evans for something Evans undeniably did. Now, if you remember, Kallikranos had acquired some of the land where Knossos is. And Evans actually dug on that land, took what he found, and shipped it back to England to the Ashmolean Museum, a big no-no on someone else's land. And Evans was probably only saved by an unfavorable judgment at court by the fact that Kallikranos died the next year in 1908. Over the next decade, Evans actually spent quite a lot of time at Knossos, which it seemed like he couldn't bear to leave. He actually built a house nearby, and there he hosted archaeologists from all over the world. And he was so passionate about the whole thing that he actually published his findings, his report from the site, which are so detailed and thorough that they still kind of stand out and set a standard for today. And remember, way back from, I think it was episode 1, as I mentioned, even today, a lot of archaeologists never get around to publishing their findings, which is a big problem for the discipline. World War I, of course, stopped all of that. But in the 1920s, Evans once again funded work at the site, this time enlisting architect Piet de Jong to do an even further reconstruction on site. And he used a lot of modern construction materials like concrete to produce totally speculative features on the upper floors, for example. And this went well beyond what he had done previously, where he used, reasonably good inferences from the archaeological ruins on site to sort of reconstruct or reconstitute things like the frescoes. Here, he was taking a big leap to doing totally imaginative stuff, and also destroyed even more and incalculable archaeological information along the way. However, whatever you think of this, and it would certainly be a big no-no today, definitely more than controversial, it just wouldn't happen. It's thanks to Evans's passion and his funds that we know as much about the site and the whole civilization as we do today. When you look at some of the really shoddy techniques of early archaeologists and antiquarians in this day, he certainly did a much more thorough job than they would have done, and he hung on to the stuff he found. Anyway, so now for the site visit. As I mentioned, it's very accessible from Heraklion, even on public transport. So if you do find yourself in Crete, there's no excuse not to go there. But remember, you have to go to the Heraklion Archaeological Museum first for you to really get the most out of your visit. The other good thing is it's definitely not going to break the bank. I think the combined cost of the entry to the museum and the site of Knossos itself is just like 15 euros. Kids, I think up to 5 enter free. And if you're an EU citizen up to age 25, it's also totally free. Now, of course, on your visit, you'll see the reconstructed elements, including the outer court of the throne room and the throne room itself that you can walk into. But remember, that throne was not necessarily for a king, or as the Linear B Mycenaean tablets call him, the Wanax. Another star attraction is the main staircase, which actually is where it was and was found to some extent intact, but is also, of course, heavily reconstructed and involves some bit of imagination in reconstructing it and putting the finishing touches on it, like the paint. Of course, you'll see the frescoes too, but I believe pretty much all of the originals are in the museum because they're fragile. And in any event, what you see in the museum and what you see on site certainly are largely repainted and sort of imagined with inference from the fragments that they did find. And of course, you'll see a lot of other reconstructed elements like columns, walls, anything on the upper floors, of course. But it really should serve as a basis to help you imagine what Knossos must have been like in its heyday. But remember, it's just sort of informed imagination, as ultimately was Arthur Evans' vision that you see on site. And as I pretty much always say about archaeological sites, Knossos, as impressive as its history is, pretty much is just a pile of stones if you don't really know what you're looking at. Trust me, the pictures you take there, they're not going to blow you or your friends away. And more than most sites, this site is very, very complex with lots of layers of stratigraphy and phasing. Remember, the place lasted like 700 years and was built and rebuilt and destroyed many times. So you'll really want a guide to sort of take you through it. Even me, who had already studied it to some extent before going there, I realized that had I not gotten my guide, it would have been a totally different and not as rich experience. Not only will your guide refresh you on the history, but he or she will certainly point out a lot of stuff that you would have missed along the way, like all those carved double axes hiding all over the place. Okay, so Knossos. Not to be missed, as indeed much of Crete is not to be missed. It will show you a much older side of Greece that you probably didn't know existed, certainly much older than those guys in the togas at the Parthenon, and it's definitely a site you won't soon forget. So there you have it, Knossos. 5 out of 5 stars in my book.
You remind me of the babe.
What babe?
Babe with the power.
What power?
Power of voodoo.
Voodoo?
You do.
The what?
Remind me of the babe.
Quiet! A goblin babe.
Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.